Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. My name is Eve Grinstead. I am the program officer for the Institute here with my colleague James in the back. As a little introduction to the Institute, for those of you that don't know it, we opened last year after several years of planning on Columbia campus to create a new Institute for Advanced Study that would not just have researchers from Columbia come together, but also artists and writers from around the world. Tosh was one of our fellows last year, one of the first in the first cohort of fellows, and he had the idea to establish the Kembara Southeast Asia Festival with one of our steering committee members, Carol Gluck, who's not here tonight, as a means to celebrate and share information about the arts and culture of Southeast Asia. So this is the third event of this series, and we're delighted to invite these four women here tonight to talk about their work and hopefully teach you guys something about their culture. So without further ado, I present to you Tash Ah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eve, and thank you to all our participants for making their way from far away, and thank you all for coming. We're very fortunate today to have in one room some incredible writers from Malaysia and Singapore. We have, first of all, YZ Chin from Malaysia, Amanda Lee Koe from Singapore, Preeta Samarasan from Malaysia, and Sharlene Teo from Singapore. We don't have much time. We're going to try and give you a brief introduction into the work of these four fascinating and I believe very important writers, and talk about some of the issues that arise in their work, which might be sort of the issues that are relevant to all of us, all of you here today who are interested in global literature and in literature in general. So I'd like to start with a question to all of you. All the questions are going to be to all of you, about how important it is to all of you to reshape what we understand to be the canon of literature, of existing literature, because it seems to me that all your work addresses a kind of correction in what we know and understand to be the literature of Southeast Asia. Who would like to go? Preeta, sorry to call on you, first of all. Your novel, Evening as a Whole Day, is set in Malaysia. It's set more specifically in your hometown, which is actually also the hometown of my mother, called Ipoh. Talk us a little bit through what happens in the novel and why it was important for you to write it.
Well, I think I actually... Is this thing on? Can you all hear me? No, it's got a light on. Maybe. Hang on.
Is it green?
Now it's on. Now it's on. Okay. The novel was so long in the making that it sort of changed, in my mind as I was working on it. And it was very much in the beginning character-driven, but as I progressed, I think I began to think of it more and more as a novel about the May 1969 racial riots, which is odd to say because it really, that if in terms of content, takes up only one chapter in the book, but I see that event, that political event, as the force that drives the narrative, and in the novel is my attempt to sort of explore how politics is personal, how politics affects family lives, how politics shapes family lives in a very real way in Southeast Asia, but also I think in the rest of the world. And I think what drove me, I think what changed my thinking about the novel, as I progressed from it being about sort of these two female characters to being about the ways in which politics had shaped their lives and the lives of the people around them, was the fact that the 1969 riots had been not very much covered in Southeast Asian fiction. Yeah, there were a few. There's Lloyd Fernando's Green is the Color.
Talk to us a little bit about the riots, for those who don't understand, who aren't familiar with the riots.
They happened... In 1969, an opposition party made some important gains in the general elections in Malaysia, and there was, it's kind of a complicated story, but basically the ruling party, which had ruled since independence in 1957, was very threatened by that, and it wasn't an all-out, it wasn't a victory, but they were threatened by the gains that the opposition had made, and so what had begun as a victory parade by the opposition quickly escalated into, and it was not the first incidence of race riots in Malaysia or in the region, but it escalated very quickly. And until today, there's disagreement about what the death toll was, for example, and what the causes were even, is still sort of disputed. And I would say that on the opposition or anti-establishment side, it's acknowledged that the riots were engineered by a sort of chauvinist, ethno-nationalist faction in the ruling party that wanted to sort of consolidate its power, whereas, of course, the faction itself that then ended up taking power and keeping power until last year tells a different story about it. But anyway, does that...
But the net result was that many hundreds of people were murdered because they were ethnically Chinese or ethnically Indian.
Exactly, and I think particularly the Chinese were the in terms of the death toll, at least the biggest victims. Many people were, again, like I said, the death toll is disputed, but it's I think indisputable that hundreds of people died, and it really changed the path of Malaysia, because starting in 1970, the year after the riots, the economic policies that have shaped Malaysia and the sort of political, basically the racially divided system that we have today can trace itself back to 1969 and the riots. And the economic policies that were then put in place under the pretext of, well, we have to sort of safeguard Malay sensibilities, and we have to make sure that the dominant majority in this country doesn't feel threatened by the minorities. And so all of these policies were put in place that are actually still in place today, even with the opposition government having taken over last year. A lot of them are still in place, and it's very, very wide-ranging. It goes into quotas for higher education, housing loans, land allocation. I mean, it's very, very wide-ranging.
When I read your novel, I thought it was very powerful to read about the way in which the presence of the state is it's omnipresent, and yet the characters are still surviving. They're still striving to lead normal lives. It all filters down. The relationship between the state and the individual is very strong. Now, Sharlene, in your book, that's possibly, it's not so pronounced, but knowing Singapore as I do, it's nonetheless there. A lot of the action takes place in a school, in the very sort of the strict confines of a Singapore state school. Talk us through your novel, Ponti, please.
Ponti is a short form for Pontianak, so that's a Southeast Asian sort of mythical cannibalistic entity, and it's about a woman called Amisa Tan who acts as a monster in a series of B horror movies made in Singapore between the late 70s and the early 80s. It's very, very much about the idea of sort of being a sort of woman or a female body moving through different sort of decades in a city that is sort of rapidly evolving. So it's about the kind of decay or evolution of the female body, kind of mirrored in the progress of a city. And a lot of the kind of present sort of action takes place, as you said, in the kind of institution of a girls' school, which has its very, very kind of strict sort of set of rules and codes of behavior. And it's really about kind of individuals sort of trying to exist as individuals within that kind of very, very kind of conforming system.
How much of your own understanding of Singapore, your own experience of growing up in Singapore, made its way into the novel?
I think they always say that the first novel is the kind of product of the kind of compass heap of your imagination. So all the kind of trauma from your childhood, all the bad dreams that goes into the first one.
Because the book is not. It doesn't make you want to go to a Singapore girls' school, basically. Let's put it that way.
I mean, yeah, it's hell. It's horrible. It's like sweaty and everyone's really terrible and they're all comparing sports bras and like saying mean things to each other. But I think like being a teenager is its own sort of like hell, but it also has moments of kind of surreal pleasures which you don't get as a jaded adult. And I kind of wanted to explore that as well, like how we are our kind of freshest selves, I think, in that formative period. I think actually, I thought about it, I think that all our interests and who we are as people, they're probably formed in that kind of nascent period up till you're about 15 and a half, and everything else is just a shadow of that. So everything that you like now, your cultural tastes, your kind of political inclinations, they're all sort of, I think, responding to those early stirrings.
Because in the novel, you also have a sense of Singapore changing very, very rapidly in the background. Is that something that you think about, or is present in your thoughts as a writer?
Yeah, I think like as a Singaporean that's lived overseas for the last 13 years, every time I land in Singapore, it sounds like such a trite kind of line, but I get like whacked with like the air, like the humidity, and with that the kind of like robotic metropolis of like Changi, and it's kind of an uncanny, familiar kind of heart pain, strange feeling. And every time I go back, obviously the facades of buildings have evolved. My own neighborhood has changed. The kinds of signifiers of memories and kind of aesthetic and nostalgic references that has all changed. And with that is my kind of understanding that the city that I know that I can claim to be familiar with is not the same thing anymore. So I'm just constantly retreading nostalgic ground. And I think, the idea of sort of authenticity, how authentically I'm depicting something, even on an affective level, I think that really changes.
Okay, we can come back to sort of notions of authenticity, because that's something that's very important, I think, to all of us. And also the relationship with one's home country, because I think I'm right in saying all of you now live away from your home countries. So that's something that the relationship between the writer and her origins, I think, is very important. This notion of women being in an epic sweep of time is also very relevant to your work, Amanda, but it's a very different take on the woman in a historical sweep of history. Could you tell us a little bit about Delayed Rays of a Star?
I will try. As you say, it's quite sweeping, so I sometimes find it hard to summarize. And in essence, it has nothing actually to do with being Singaporean or even sort of Asian per se. But I mean, which I will talk about later, I think.
I disagree with that, but I'll
I agree sort of on a deeper level, but on the superficial level, it's never read that way. But so Delayed Rays of a Star is a novel about the interconnecting personal and political destinies of three women who appear together in a picture in a party in Berlin in 1928. So it's Marlene Dietrich. I mean, everyone knows Marlene Dietrich, right? I feel. May Wong, she was the first Asian American film star to have made it both in Hollywood as well as internationally. She also found work in Germany and in London. And Leni Riefenstahl, but before she was Hitler's favorite propagandist, when she was just a dancer and an actress. And in fact, I don't think she was actually very well trained as a dancer, but I think when you're in sort of the cradle of modernity, you get to sort of define what modern dance was, and she was kind of just doing these cartwheels on the beach. And this is before she ever picked up a movie camera. And so all three of them appear in a photograph taken by Alfred Eisenstadt, who's the guy who did the Times Square picture of the nurse and the sailor. And he was also a rookie photographer in Berlin at that point, covering social events for Life magazine. And so this picture that was taken in 1928, it was this snapshot of the three of them when all three were still ingenues, before they had really discovered what it was they were going to be very famous for very soon in their lives. And so the novel kind of begins from this starting point of the Eisenstadt photo, which we actually paid for the rights to reproduce on the frontispiece. And then it kind of fractures in the different directions that life takes these women, or is it sort of how the women take their own lives into their own hands? I think this question of sort of female agency is very germane to the novel. And I guess what I kind of have been sort of resisting, but also resisting talking about is my own relation to this sort of material. Because on the one hand, I feel that I don't want to have to defend why I would write this novel. But on the other hand, I mean, when you talk about like the compost heap of, sort of teenage stirrings, so growing up as a queer teenager in Singapore, I literally thought that there were no adult gay people. And no, really, yeah.
You should come to Malaysia.
Oh, and so Marlene Dietrich for me was actually my teenage queer icon, and I grew up with a picture of her, a poster, an illustrated poster of her in these green gloves on my bedroom wall, and I think that she was just so removed from anything that I saw around me, and I guess I sort of escaped the motherland maybe a little later than Preeta and Sharlene, and so maybe sort of had more need to have sort of an interface between me and sort of the banality of reality around me that would not condone my existence. And I think Marlene, for me, I mean, I think that in modern parlance, we would call her a pansexual, not even a bisexual. I mean, she just had these incredible relationships with both men and women, and she was married. And she created sort of really her own opportunities for herself as well. At the point where the photo was taken, she was in no way destined to become a star. She was just trying out for these bit parts where, as in the audition was to be the maid who placed a glass on the table, and she would show up to these auditions in like fox furs and monocles and gloves, you know. And so I feel like the novel is really about sort of female ambition, and it's also about, I guess, whether your decisions sort of can stand the test of time, but sort of without being anachronistic about it.
I want to get Wisey to explain about her book, but one of the ways I think that these two books link is this idea of female agency and female independence, female choices, and the way one of the ways in which these choices and agency are manifested in your novel, at least, and also I think in Wisey's, is with this idea through an idea of exile, which might or might not mirror your own experiences of leaving Singapore and taking control of your life and actually reshaping it and reinventing yourself, or maybe just continuing a reinvention that already started when you were in Singapore. But Wisey, in your book, the whole notion of exile and estrangement from one's family takes on it's a force. It's something forced. It's forced by political choice, by political actions.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. So my book is my attempt to, first of all, answer what is it like to live under censorship, government, not allowing a speaker on campus, not like that. It's like real censorship.
It's having the government
have
a very strict regime of what you can or cannot say.
Exactly, yeah. So the main character of my book is a woman who is detained without trial, thrown in jail indeterminately for on the charge of writing offensive, like sexually lewd poems. And so this is a character who is an ethnic minority in Malaysia. And her relationship to her country is shaped by various factors, such as her grandfather worked for colonial officers, British colonial officers, when the country was occupied, and how she, as an ethnic minority, may not necessarily feel, the highest patriotism for a country. But when she's sort of exiled, as you put it, under forced circumstances, she actually ends up taking up the mantle, like she sort of takes charge of her sentence and decides to sort of play the role of a political martyr and say, I'm doing this for the good of my country, even though that was absolutely not the starting point of her being put in jail. It wasn't something that she wanted or asked for or had any intention. She didn't want to be a martyr. But once she was in that situation, she in a way, took charge of her fate. Yeah.
Because political censorship or censorship in general is a very real thing in Malaysia.
Yes, yeah. There are many examples. A cartoonist, Zunar, was put in jail, and he's a creative person. He's spoken out against multiple, the previous government who's long in power, and also the new government that came in power last year. He's equally critical of the highest powers. And there's also other frivolous charges like Bilqis Hijaz, a dancer who released yellow balloons with just words on them that said like justice or fairness or something. And she was arrested for that.
How important is this awareness of political censorship in general? Because all of us have grown up in this under regimes of varying degrees. And, I speak to the Malaysian situation more than the Singaporean one, which I'm not very familiar with, but certainly for in Malaysia it's a very real thing. How has that affected your thinking as a writer?
So it really took leaving Malaysia for me to realize how much censorship has shaped me as a person and a writer. It wasn't until I left Malaysia and took a writing class really that my professor pointed out that I had a reluctance to write certain things like sex. Not that every writer should write about sex, but it was relevant, I promise, when this was brought up. Like, where's the sex in your writing? And really, it was really shocking for me to realize, of course, we all have our pretensions. I had thought of myself as on my way to becoming a writer, but then to realize that really I had blinders on, I wasn't allowing myself to say so many of these things was really shocking to me and made me really rethink my childhood and all that I had been growing up, what I had been steeped in, which is very informed by censorship.
Preeta, can you also talk a little bit on the subject of how writers, or how you have dealt with the whole idea of being a writer, or how growing up in a system where censorship is a very present thing? Mm. Because this is a conversation I have quite a lot with friends of mine who live here in France or in Britain or America, where really it's not something that ever enters their thinking. Lots of other things make life difficult for writers in terms of how they envisage life as a writer, how they envisage their work, but actually in terms of saying what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say, there aren't that many institutionalized things.
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer is going to be shaped by the fact that I sort of found my path to becoming a writer, or writing creatively at least, after leaving. And I think that process of leaving, I don't know, I mean, it's quite complicated because I think I grew up in a family that, within the family circle, like in the security of our home, my parents were quite outspoken. My parents were quite politically outspoken, and we talked about things with the understanding that, this doesn't leave, which I suppose is its own kind of censorship. But I think that the process of leaving, gradually I realized, I mean, I still think that there are lots of things that I allow myself to say, whether in my fiction or on social media, that I probably would not say if I was still living there. But I also think, I mean, maybe this is another layer that we need to explore. I also think that the fact that I write in English provides a kind of thin additional layer of security. I think that people who are writing in the national language, in Bahasa Malaysia, are subject to more censorship and more scrutiny. And I mean, a good friend of mine once actually raised to this. It's Amir Muhammad, who's at the time was a Malaysian filmmaker. He's worn many hats since, but at the time he was making films, and every single one of his films was being banned by the authorities. And one day he was at a party with people from the censorship board happened to be there, and he said, how is it that, and he cited a few novels, I don't think my novel had come out at the time, but he cited a few things in English that had come out and that were quite critical of the government, and he said, how is it that you let these things be out there, but you ban all of my novels? And the censor actually said to him, novels, I mean, nobody reads novels in English, and novels in English are fine. You can say whatever you want in English. So I think I heard this well after I'd written my novel, but I think it rings somewhat true. I don't think they're completely oblivious, but I do feel, and maybe, I mean, maybe someday I'll be proven wrong, but I do feel a little bit of freedom to say what I want to say in English, which I think would be very different if I were a blogger or if I were a journalist, but especially, I think particularly fiction in English.
Why do you think that is? I mean, I think I know the explanation, but perhaps for the audience, you might want to explain how you feel the distinction between English and, say, Bahasa Malaysia as giving you that. Why does English enjoy this this position, this privilege?
Well, I mean, I think because the people who are reading fiction in English in Malaysia would tend to, and again, I don't want to generalize too much, but I think they would tend to agree, for the most part, with my position or my perspective, whereas Bahasa Malaysia, being the national language, is the sort of the language of enforcement and the language of authority and the language of the establishment, and also has a much wider reach, like people in the dominant majority read fiction in Malay, who would probably be very unlikely to pick up a novel in English. And again, it's not, there are people who read in English, but I think it's a question of much wider reach and much wider, much deeper impact because of that. Yeah.
The idea of distance, has that been a freeing thing for you?
Yeah, very much so. It's freeing in two ways, I think. It's not just feeling like, oh, I'm not going to be, I don't have to worry that, someone's going to show up and arrest me. But it's also, I think, and maybe freeing is not quite the word, but I find that my perspective is sort of broader, it's different. I see things differently because I live far away, and you sort of get this, I mean, many writers have spoken about this because exile, of course, is not unique to Malaysian writers, and many writers who've left their homeland have talked about this, about how once you get that distance, you sort of see the big picture, and you see, and I think you talked about this earlier when you said, when you go home and you have this, and I find that when I go home to Malaysia, I don't write for that 1 month that I'm home every year, because it's this very powerful, both psychological, psychic, emotional, you're taking in all of this stuff in a way that then I need the distance to digest and to sort of say, well, what did that all mean, and what is happening and in the country and in myself, and I don't know how. I guess I never really had the chance to see how that would work for me if I hadn't left. I don't know if I would have written about Malaysia or what my writing would have been like.
This distance also raises the question of authenticity, which Sharlene, you mentioned earlier. How do you deal with this? Is this something you're aware of? Because it's something that we talked about earlier, that writers of color are always subject to. How authentic is your work? Which is something that white writers actually are never subject to.
I mean, it's definitely a thing. Like, if you're not white, you're automatically supposed to be a cultural representative. You're supposed to kind of like speak for everyone in a way which is, I think, like logistically and creatively impossible. I've always found those arguments really. I mean, at the moment I hear it, I'm just like, ugh, ugh. But I think it speaks to, I think, the reader's demand for what is sort of a true voice, like a writer that's basically like not a hack, like someone not trying to kind of put the wool over your eyes or condescend the reader or condescend the kind of fictional context drawn from life that they're trying to write about. But I think if you're a writer who's lived overseas in your adult life, there are kind of additional layers of sort of cognitive and existential reckoning which come with the fact that your past self, your present self, and I don't know what about the future self, are very, very much stamped in a kind of physical location and also a cultural location, and the kinds of associative ideas with that, which evolve and change depending on how proximate or far away you are from the first place and the second place, and kind of these very muddied ideas of what is home and like where you sort of belong to or where you can claim a belonging to. For me, I mean, I've lived in London for 10 years, but I don't really feel any inclination to write about London, or I would never write about English people. I mean, there's more than enough stuff about that, it's fine. Every time when I've tried to write stories set in London, I'll be like, oh, a Singaporean character in London, huh? I'll be like, he turned left, and it becomes like Google Maps. It's like, oh, look, I'm describing a place that I see all the time, and it's just horrible. It's so bad. So yeah.
Whereas in Ponti, there's a very, very tight and very intense relationship between the characters and where they live. What is your relationship with Singapore right now, in this phase of your life?
I think it's kind of like heart pain.
Heart pain.
Like heart pain. Like every time I see like a man like an Asian man around my dad's age, I feel like this like kind of heart pain. I'm like, oh, and it's like, then I kind of check myself, and I'm like, what does that actually mean? And like,
What does that mean?
I don't know. Like, I don't know. I think
Because
it just comes with.
It's not as if you can't go back to Singapore. I mean, you can go back there very freely. So what does that? I mean,
I
I'm
think
just
it's just more of a
interested in
general
how
reaction of
right.
being this age and like having like my parents are getting older, that are geographically far away from me, and not living in the home like out of choice, frankly. Like, so this kind of desire to kind of assert my independence sounds like some kind of Disney character. That kind of twin desire of trying to assert my independence, but also feeling a great deal of sort of guilt as like the child away from home. So it's quite regressive.
Although in some ways I feel that you know, we've talked about this before, that I feel in some ways your novel is a very Singaporean novel. It doesn't actually take place in Singapore. Does that speak to how you work out your relationship with Singapore?
Well, I mean, I feel that how, to me, sort of my novel relates to me and my identity as a Singaporean, as in, it's just that I'm unwilling to sort of connect with certain aspects of my Singaporean identity and more interested in exploring others. So I think what I do connect with in terms of being Singaporean is this idea of being a cosmopolitan, but I mean that in its modernist sense of the word, like sort of the way we would think of a cosmopolitan in the 1920s and not in the here and now. So I think there's the cosmopolitan part, and then there's the queer part, and then there's also sort of, I guess, the part of me that, I mean, I love cinema. I majored in cinema studies back in Singapore and was just enamored of Weimar culture and sort of Dada art history and surrealism and all that. So I just feel that, and I don't know whether it was in some ways an inward exile whilst growing up in Singapore and sort of not finding the things I wanted to find within the culture there. But so I think that these were the things that came to the fore for me when I was working on this novel. But in terms of, but I feel that that's sort of the sort of this level of how I see it for myself. But in terms of the novel in and of itself, I think how it's Singaporean in a sense is that it's very, there are a lot of moving bodies. I mean, Marlena moves from Berlin to Hollywood and becomes a star there, but May Wong, facing racism within Hollywood, goes to Europe because there was more sort of an appetite for, and I think she was very canny also in terms of a willingness to self-exoticize to some degree. And I feel that as an Asian who has grown up in a majority race back in Singapore, Chinese people were like the white people of Singapore, in a sense. I feel that it gave me sort of more layers to look at her as an Asian American than an Asian American author might have. Because I think that quite often she's spoken about just in terms of how she came up against sort of racism within the Hollywood film industry, but then no one really wants to talk about how she also played, an Eskimo character or a Native American princess. She played Tiger Lily in Peter Pan, and so, which partially, of course, is a problem of the scarcity of the industry, but it's also this idea of representation, of course. And then I think that, and they're also sort of, I guess it's hard to talk about my novel because now I've made it sound as if it's just about these three women, but there are a whole host of really sort of, when I say vibrant side characters, I'm not like praising myself, I just mean vibrant in terms of, because the women are historical figures, they've already made their decisions in the long arm of time, whereas the side characters are fictional and so carry sort of this burden of plot. And so they have more vibrancy in that sense. And I guess within the side characters, they have a lot of, they make a lot of sort of physical movements that are also speak to sort of a mental state. And I feel that this idea of migration is very much, germane to me as a Singaporean living in New York now.
I also find that they're all in search of their identity, of an identity, trying to figure out who they are, really, which is a very Singaporean thing, because I find that's what Singapore is involved in right now, and a lot of your writing is involved with this idea of identity, of national identity, but also personal identity. But you mentioned, I want to pick up on something you mentioned, which is self-exoticization in the case of May Wong. And I want to ask YZ what you feel about that, but it's also a question that applies to all of you, because all these ideas, self-exoticization, authenticity, representation, are always things that writers of color have to deal with. Also, writers of color, or more particularly from outside of the Anglo-American dominated publishing world. So how do you deal with that, if you do deal with that at all?
Yeah, so Sharlene said earlier about how as writers of color, sometimes we're made to be representatives of whatever is perceived as our culture. So at readings, I've had people ask me about, recent political events in Malaysia, ask me as if I were a political analyst. And I've also had people come up after readings to say, oh, I can't imagine living in a place like that, with the intonation. And so how I deal with that is I try to tell these people, or tell readers who are interested in learning more about Malaysia, not necessarily from me. I recommend books by other writers. I tell them to seek up online articles that I find useful, and then just sort of try to make it clear that my concerns with the novel aren't just, I did not set out to write a tour guide. I did not set out to write like how-to book about Malaysia, but there are other concerns that I'm more interested in discussing, while also not downplaying, of course, how rooted in Malaysia my work is, naturally.
Preeta, representations of Malaysia, is this something that troubles you? So the representation. So, example, in YZ's book, which is about political repression, it is about the very, very difficult relationship between the state and the individual. Which, and for most people in Malaysia, you can get by in your daily life, and you can have a perfectly functioning life under what is essentially quite a repressive regime. But every so often, the regime does sort of descend with devastating effect onto someone's life. And it is a big thing. It's a big deal. It's a huge presence. How do you stop that from becoming the only narrative in literature, or do you even care?
I guess I don't think about it so consciously, at least not in the early stages, in the actual writing process, because I think as writers, we always begin with the story, with the characters, and we don't think, well, I should not let it become too political, or I should make it too political. I think that way leads to, basically bad writing. Does that answer your question a little bit, or?
Yeah, no. I'm sort of interested to know how you think of these things in terms as of your own writing, but also more generally what you feel about the responsibility on a writer, ethnically Indian writer, writing in from Malaysia, for an audience that's both Malaysian and international.
Yeah,
what responsibilities do you have?
Yeah, increasingly, people always say, well, at least when I was in creative writing classes, we were taught that the audience, write for someone like yourself, write for a reader like yourself. But I do increasingly think of myself as writing for a Malaysian audience, and my goal that I always tell myself, that I don't want to deviate from is to write for Malaysians, but to have other people listen because they want to be able to eavesdrop on a conversation that's between us, and that does not center outsiders, that does not center the Western reader. And so it involves a certain amount of work on their part, because if you're eavesdropping, then nothing is explained to you, nothing, it's an unmediated conversation, basically, and that's my goal. But it is, when my first novel came out, it is, I think of it as a political novel, but it is very much, it's about one Indian family. And I remember that some of the responses that I got from Western readers who, say, knew Malaysia a little bit, or just, had been there several times, or even people who had lived there, they said things like, Malaysia's a multiracial country. Why doesn't your book have more Malay characters? Where are the Chinese people? Why are none of the main, why is there only one minor character who never gets her own voice, who's Chinese? Where are the Malay characters? Which I think, these are questions that would never be asked of, like I used Ian McEwan as an example, but, we can choose any Jonathan Franzen or any majority white writer in the US or UK doesn't get asked, like, where are the Hispanic people, and why are you not writing them? In fact, it's often the other way. It's sort of flipped, which is its own problem. So, yeah, it is something that I think about, but I try not to. I just feel that if once we allow that to sort of color our work, or we feel we allow the people to put the burden of representation on us, that then we're not really storytellers anymore. We're doing something else. That's some other job that, as you said, then we can direct them to like journalists or there's a lot of, if you're interested in Malaysia, if you want to read something that's actually informative, don't come just to fiction to learn about a country.
Absolutely. Sharlene and Amanda, and actually, Wisey and Preeta, in the case of both Malaysia and Singapore, I think I'm right in saying that we're all very aware of writing in an environment where the publishing industry is still very, very young, in some cases not very developed. And also, despite the fact that there are non-English language writers and have been for some time, we don't have the body of work that some other countries might have, France, for example. How conscious are you about your role in shaping that body of work? Amanda, you mentioned earlier when we were chatting upstairs about the awareness of a certain kind of existence of a character in Singapore literature, the male character that lives in a certain part of Singapore. How do you deal with that?
I just think that I don't care. I really don't. I'm not a straight Chinese middle-aged man, so I don't care. Like it's just as simple as that, and I don't want to make it more complex than it has to be. And I just want. I guess with the novel, I just wanted to write about what I was obsessed about. And I think when we're talking in terms of your previous question about sort of this burden of representation, I think within the novel, I kind of try to turn it back on itself, because there's a it seems strange to say that this is a part of the novel that I like personally, but there's an encounter actually that happened in real life between Walter Benjamin and May Wong, and so he actually interviews her in Berlin in 1928, and this article was actually it has never been translated into English before, and I paid for the translation, actually out of my own pocket, for the novel, and it appears within it. And he basically, he calls her name, it sounds like tiny chopsticks, and her hair is like a dragon frolicking in water. And we think of him as this like rarefied cultural theorist, but he was grappling with these sort of, these problems of representation have existed for such a long, long time, and I feel that I was trying to sort of be both not anachronistic and anachronistic within this sort of representation, but then I guess by using sort of this framework I place it there for the reader, and then I guess you can sort of you take from it what you will, and I don't have to then sort of take it on as that burden anymore, because it just exists as a document in and of itself. True. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Sharlene, is this something you think about, the burden of representation at all?
Well, I guess it's interesting, like kind of writing about Singaporean identity or trying to explore that in fiction, because we're a very young, like kind of country that's comprised of immigrants. So you don't have, as you said, that kind of deep-rooted social cultural histories to draw upon. You don't have a long literary tradition that is monolithic in any way to draw upon. So really, national narratives of identity have always been constructed from the outset. And there's also the kind of quite underplayed issue of how multi-ethnic and how multi sort of lingual Singapore is. And as Chinese Singaporeans, we're the kind of dominant sort of ethnic group there. So you're writing from quite a very, very specific perspective. So I feel like all I'm trying to do in fiction is I'm writing to kind of try and move rather than to impress. And so I don't think I can take on all these kind of quite onerous like burdens, because I just don't have the kind of, frankly, the confidence. I'm just like chipping away. I'm just like, ugh. That's me. I'm just like a little worm. So I can't take on all that stuff. I'm not a snail. I'm a worm.
I think we probably have time for some questions, if there are any. That it's James, is there a mic? Or any questions? Yes. One question that normally gets asked is the choice of language. So the choice of writing in English. Could you each explain? I mean, I'm not really, I don't need an explanation, but it's just often non-Malaysian and Singaporean audiences are sometimes curious to know why the choice of English, which actually sometimes differs for various people.
Yeah, I don't really know if it was a choice. I think of myself as not having a first language. I think I learned to speak Chinese and read English at the same time, but I never really spoke English. So it's hard to say really what your first language is, and it's not something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. But if I had to psychoanalyze myself, I would say it's English because I was bullied as a kid, as many writers probably are. And so, the English books, I read Malay books, I read Chinese books, I read English books. But the English books, the one, Enid Blyton, as some of you may know, she was a very extremely prolific children's writer from England. In her book, mostly boys, but children my age were having these grand adventures that I didn't see in the Malay or Chinese books really. Like they would like run away from home, which is like, no Chinese children's book will ever have that. You do not disobey your parents. But anyway, so that provided for me the greatest source of inspiration and escape and childish courage. So I've just carried it on as we were talking about earlier, how your childhood experiences inform you. So
what language do you speak at home, just out of interest?
I speak Mandarin with my parents. Yeah, but they bought me English books to start me off reading for whatever reasons. Yeah.
Amanda?
I mean, we are all post-colonial subjects, so in a way I also feel it's not really a decision. It's sort of a fact of success of sort of the enterprise of empire. And in my case, I think my Mandarin firstly just practically isn't actually good enough because I didn't really pay attention during sort of Mandarin classes in Singapore, and for the longest time I thought that my Mandarin, like that I disliked Mandarin, but as an adult I realized that what I disliked was the pedagogy of how Mandarin was taught in Singapore, which is that sort of like it's just it's like market and business vocabulary devoid of a cultural context. And then later on, I realized that, this was no accident, but it's because Mandarin was very closely tied to the leftist movement in Singapore. And so I think to remove its cultural and political component is to defang the language and to make it sort of just very capitalist and safe. And that's why I hate it, because it's just sort of the bare bones of a language for a commercial purpose. But yet again, in some ways, I am that cliche of a sort of a writer who has moved away and then, sort of not yearned for a connection to the mother tongue, but then became sort of more aware of my own connection to this language and wanted to then explore it, which I actually now do via Mandarin to English translation. And I'm finding it very fruitful, actually. So I feel like I've rehabilitated my personal relationship to Mandarin. But for that, I blame the Singapore Ministry of Education. Yeah, I do.
Sure. So English is my first language. I don't actually. We had also the option of studying your mother tongue, as it was called, on Saturdays. You could go back, and I could have gone to school for Tamil classes, but I very much did not grow up as the dominant majority. I'm kind of the opposite of you guys, because as far removed as the dominant majority, well, okay, maybe not. Maybe now, with more immigration, there are people on lower rungs of the social ladder, but when I was growing up, it was pretty much. So I grew up very ashamed of my mother tongue. I did not want to learn Tamil. I did not want to be associated with it. There was a letter that was sent home where I could go on Saturdays and study Tamil. I tore it up and threw it out. My mother found out much later that I had not wanted to sign up for these classes. So I do not actually speak. I mean, I speak Tamil quite well, but it's a non-literary, shall we say, to put it mildly, form of Tamil. I do not actually read or write it. And so the only language that I can. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a choice, but after the fact, when I had a chance to think about it, I came to think of English as, in a way, a choice, because as you said, we're post-colonial countries, and I think that English is as much, in a way, our English, like Malaysian English or Singaporean English, is a national language. It's the language that is spoken by everyone and is owned by everyone in a way that, and it doesn't have the divisive political baggage that maybe Bahasa Malaysia does have for some people. And I really believe in this project of reclaiming Malaysian English as our language. It's our English. It's as much a national language as anything else in Malaysia. And I really more and more have tried to explore writing in a register and a diction that is Malaysian.
But but just before the thought escapes me, your experience of your relationship with Tamil, it also speaks to the experience of what it means to be an ethnic minority in Malaysia, though.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
To be made to feel ashamed.
Yeah,
of
I mean, I grew up with people making fun of the way Tamil sounds. You know, you talked about bullying. I mean, that was a lot of. I mean, if you grow up Tamil or Indian actually in Malaysia, the language is a big part of it. Like people make fun of the language, the way that it sounds. And so I just disassociated myself from that. And in fact, I said earlier that I speak it pretty well because my grandmother lived with us when I was growing up, and she only spoke Tamil. But I lied about this at school. When people asked me, you know, what does this mean? I'd say, I don't know. I don't speak Tamil. Sorry, I only speak English. And so I hid for a long time the fact that I spoke Tamil, and so that my childhood friends, now that I'm an adult, are surprised to discover that in fact I speak Tamil. Why did you never tell us? Oh, I sort of picked it up later. Yeah, I mean, it is, I think it's probably, in some ways, a universal experience for a lot of ethnic minorities all over the world that, I grew up sort of, ashamed of the language and the food and the clothing, and only now I'm starting to, little by little, reclaim those things.
Sharlene?
Yes, sorry.
It's just a very simple reason. My Mandarin, I can speak it, like it's really bad. So English is the enforced lingua franca in Singapore, and I guess I speak English at home. I kind of think in English, so it just so follows that I would write in English. But I think that decision, it is a decision. Yeah, it does come with a great deal of cultural baggage, which I'm hoping to unpack. But like, I wish I thought in Chinese. That would be great, but I don't.
I think it's just, I know it's a little bit laborious, but I think it is worth explaining because, it's particularly, I think, in a country like France where, the idea of being French is tied to being French-speaking and being tied to a certain kind of culture with its own history, which actually countries like Malaysia and Singapore, which have traditionally, historically been much more multicultural, don't really share. It's not a perspective that we share. And so language, I think, also becomes divided in this way. It becomes more fractured, but also potentially more interesting, as you point out. I think we've sort of run out of time. Thank you so much for for being here, for coming all this way and sharing some of your thoughts. And thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Oh, and don't forget to mention.
And there are books for sale. All the writers have their books for sale and will be available for signings, obviously. Thank you very much.